In this demonstration, you'll see how to configure Hyper-V virtual machine replication from one Windows Server 2019 Hyper-V server to another Windows Server 2019 Hyper-V server using PowerShell. So we start here in a PowerShell session and we assign authentication credentials to a variable. This is a good way of getting a username and password in a secure manner and putting it in a variable for use later. We then create a variable related to our session. This is the variable sesh with a new PowerShell session using the credential we just stored and specifying the computer name SEA SVR1, which is our first Hyper-V server. We can then just type enter PS session and then the sesh variable, and all of those credentials and locations will be stored and used. So we clear the screen and we now have a session to SEA SVR1. The first thing we need to do on SEA SVR1 is verify whether or not the Hyper-V replica firewall rule is enabled or disabled. And we use the get network firewall rule command to do this. And we see it is not enabled because enabled is set to false. So we use the enable net firewall rule command to turn that firewall rule on, and then we verify that it is set to true for enabled. Next, we configure the replication server. So we use the set VM replication server commandlet. We enable replication. We specify the authentication type as Kerberos. We allow replication from any server to be true and specify the replication storage location to be C:\replica storage. We then type get VM replication server and we see that the outcome of running that initial command is that replication is now enabled using Kerberos authentication type over port 80 and port 443. Next, we run get-VM to simply see which virtual machines are stored on this particular Hyper-V server, SEA SVR1. And we see that we have a virtual machine called SEA Core 1, and it's in an off state at the moment. I open a second PowerShell window, and I'm going to use this second PowerShell window to configure a second Hyper-V server for replication. So here I capture my authentication credentials in a variable named cred. I create a new variable called sesh1 and then specify the Hyper-V server SEA SVR2. I then do an enter PS session for sesh1 and I authenticate and connect to SEA SVR2. I change to the root directory and I clear the screen. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting these windows side by side so that you can see me run commands on each. Okay, so on SVR2, I need to check the firewall rule for replication. I see it's not enabled. I need to turn it on, and then I verify that it is now enabled. Next, I can configure the replication server properties so that replication is enabled on SVR2. I clear the screen, and I type get VM replication server, and I verify that now SVR2 is enabled for replication. I do a get VM and SVR2's got no VMs, SVR1 has 2. I reorganise the windows again because we couldn't get everything on the screen when they were side by side, but if I put them one over the other, I can actually see what's going on. So I do a get VM and I see on SVR1 that SEA Core 1 is in an off state. I now use the enable replication commandlet to configure replication for SEA Core and specify the destination server as SEA SVR2. Replication is now enabled for that virtual machine. I then use the start VM initial replication commandlet to initiate replication. I can use the get VM replication commandlet to determine the status of replication. I run that a few times until I get the state of get VM replication where the state is replicating. Now that the state is set to replicating, I can perform a failover. So I go to the command prompt associated with SEA SVR2. I do a get VM and I can see now that SEA core 1 is now present on this server because it is now the replicated copy from SVR1. I can go back to SVR1 and run the start failover command that will prepare failover to occur. I say yes, and failover is prepared. Once that's occurred, I can start failover on SVR2. And say yes, and now SEA core 1 has failed over to SVR2. I clear the screen, I get the VM, I can see the VM is there. I can run the get VM replication command and see that it's failed over but waiting completion. Now the last thing you need to do when replicating is set up reverse replication. So I set up reverse replication and now SEA core 1 is replicating from SVR2 to SVR1. I do get VM replication and I see that that replication is now in a good state, and if I wanted to fail it back, I could. So in this demonstration, you saw how to configure virtual machine replication using PowerShell on Hyper-V servers and how to perform a failover from one Hyper-V server to another of a single virtual machine.